In this final installment of the philosophy fiction writing workshop, I want to look at how to publish your short fiction. Short fiction is usually published in magazines, and those are basically short fiction journals. Here's, for example, Clark's World. Clark's World is a very well known magazine of speculative fiction, and several people who've written in Clark's World have won the Hugo Award. And so, one thing you can do to start out is to just look at what is recently published there. So, for example, you can click here, and most of these magazines you can find the work online freely. And then you can read the story. And that gives you a feel of the markets. The markets are basically the magazines in which you can sell your short fiction. One thing to be aware of is the word count. So, for example, if your story is really short, then maybe a flash fiction magazine is a better outlet. For example, here's Flash Fiction Online. Flash Fiction Online has stories between 500 and 1,000 words. So the word count is important, and note that there are a few magazines, there are some that take anything above 7,500 words. So that's something to be aware of. So you familiarize yourself with these magazines. You might think, how do I find these magazines? Well, there are two websites that are very handy that both give you lists of which magazines are available and that also give you information about turnaround times, rejection rates, and so on. So here's Duotrope. Duotrope lists a very wide range of magazines. One of the downsides is it is a paying service. And you can basically get an account, log in, and then look at different markets. So here is, for instance, Epiphany, a literary journal. And you can click on that and you get some ideas about when it was established, how often it is published, whether it is currently open to submissions. That's something important to keep in mind. What sort of stories they want, what the length of the stories is, and also whether they pay. Pay is very interesting, so this is a bit unfamiliar for academic writers, but you do often, but not always, get paid when you submit, when your story gets accepted to a literary magazine. And sometimes there's also fees that you have to, so a publication fee, although many do not ask that. And the other service where you can look at different magazines is called the Submission Grinder. The Submission Grinder is very interesting because you can see here in recent activity, you can see what people have logged. So what happens is people basically, whenever they submit a story, they log where they've submitted it to. And it's very handy in your own account, so you can make your own account. And then on the dashboard, you can see what you've all submitted and how where you've all submitted it, how long it took for those things to come back, and where it's been accepted. Now, if you click on a given magazine, for example here Apex, then you can see here a short description, namely a science fiction, fantasy, and horror with an edge. And you also see what sort of length they want here and how much they pay. This is a paying market. And then the genres, fantasy, horror, science fiction. And also always look at the website itself, whether they want, how they want submission. Electronically, this is more and more the case. Postal submissions is getting rarer. Whether they accept things that have already been published, namely reprints, yes or no. Usually the answer is no, although occasionally they do, but you do have to mark things as reprints. Here is an important thing to note. If you have put your story anywhere on a publicly available or viewable platform, such as your blog or your Medium page or a publicly viewable Facebook page, then it actually counts as published. And then you would have a hard time selling it to a magazine that doesn't want any reprints. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. This is also different from academic publishing, where you can actually often put something on, say, PhilPapers or another server, or Academia Edu, before you then submit it to a journal, but you can't really do that with a magazine. So that's reprints. Then there's multiple submissions, so they will always specify, also always go to the actual website, and I'll show you in a moment what that looks like. Whether they want multiple submissions, which is it okay to send more than one story at the same time? Whether they are okay with simultaneous submissions. So in academic publishing, simultaneous submissions are a big no. You cannot send your academic paper to more than one journal at the same time. However, with fiction magazines, it is sometimes allowed. Then it would say yes here. If it is not allowed, if it is allowed though, then you do have to be clear with them that you are simultaneously submitting it, and also tell them as soon as it's accepted elsewhere. Now you see here that a journal like Apex is a very prominent literary magazine, that they have a very high rejection rate. And this rejection rate is quite reliable because so many people log on the submission grinder. So you don't have those effects of people who are happy that something is accepted, because people just log anything. And it also gives you the amount of personal rejections. This is also interesting to note. So the waiting times at literary magazines tend to be shorter, although you have to check here how short they are. So in this case, 12 days on average that you have to wait for a rejection, 16 days on average for an acceptance. And in fact, the submission grinder curates the data and shows you an idea of the turnaround time, so you have a sense of where you are on this curve. You can even zoom in and get an idea, and then see, like you see that the acceptances and rejections here are all over the map. So that can really help you to make a decision about where to submit. But before you actually submit, I really do recommend that you go to the actual magazine and spend some time with it, and actually learn about the market and see, is the story that I'm submitting, is it something that would at least sort of fit in what they publish. Now you do see that in this case with Apex, you see that they do have this idea of our mission. Like, we want to strive to entertain you with entertaining, diverse, and thought-provoking fiction. Our goal is to challenge your perceptions, rattle your beliefs, shake you free of the expected path. We want you to read our content and then afterwards think, now that's only a story you'll find in Apex magazine. So they're committed to professionalism, accountability, quality, and diversity. And so once you read that mission and you spend some actual time reading the stories, you head over to the submission guidelines, and you see here, for example, they want something to be submitted in what is called Shun standard manuscript format. And I'm going to talk about that in a short while, because almost all magazines want this format. And they'll tell you whether they pay and whether they podcast it, and about what they're looking for. And here you then can submit. And this is actually this is the Moksha platform, is a platform that is often used, and you can even see with that platform how far you are along in the queue, and whether your story is going to be read and very probably rejected soon. Now, some magazines, here you have Flash Fiction Online, which is a flash fiction magazine, a general flash fiction magazine. They also give you a list, in addition to the helpful guidelines about what to do when you submit. So you can click here on submissions, and you see here also what are they looking for, whether they're open to submissions, what the story length. Please don't do anything outside that, because that's just going to be an instant rejection. Whether they want simultaneous submissions, multiple submissions. And particularly with Flash Fiction Online, you have to anonymize your work. So you have to look at that in particular. Now, Flash Fiction Online also gives you an overview of hard sells. And it's quite interesting to look at those for a little bit. Hard sells are just things that are just very difficult to sell. Uh, it's not going to be no, although for some of them it is, but it's very likely going to increase your chance that your story will get rejected. So they want, for example, no sexist stories. They don't want second POV. They don't want polemical fiction. They don't want stories featuring the evil human race because it's really just done to death. They don't want stories that poke fun of somebody else's religious or political belief or unnamed characters, or even, quite interestingly, they don't want stories about downtrodden characters in depressing, hopeless situations. If you see those list of hard sells, then it's worthwhile thinking, is there another venue that is okay with things like blood and violence and stories that are super pessimistic and so on? And then you submit, and then you wait. Now, how do you format your story? So this is one final thing I want to look at. Head over to this website, Schönnet Format Story. And then you can find here how to format your story in either modern manuscript format or classic manuscript format. I'm going to click on modern because I have the sense that this is increasingly what people want. So a story that you submit to a magazine is always formatted as follows. It has the word count here, rounded to the nearest 100. It here has your name and contact details, your pronouns. If you want to include them, you don't have to. Any sort of membership that is relevant, usually writing literary societies, don't put your membership of the American Philosophical Association here. It's not particularly going to help you. Here you have the title, which is centered and put about halfway the page. And here you have your byline, which is basically the name as you want it to appear. Suppose that your name is William Schoen, you want to appear as Bill Schoen, you put it as follows. And you always indent 1/2 inch. You also have to make sure that there are margins of 1 inch throughout. And so I would recommend also don't justify it, just put it sort of left, paragraphs double spaced. So just look at that in detail. And another thing that might be worth pointing out is if you want an empty line to appear to sort of separate different sections in your story, then you put this hashtag in between. And it's more and more the custom to actually put words italic that are italic and no longer underline them. But anyway, just look at this in detail and then submit your story like that. Don't send it as a PDF. Usually what people want is a Word document format or ODT. So that's basically it. You then submit and you wait. And basically you can expect many rejections. I think one very helpful piece of advice that I saw once is aim for 100 rejections a year. So if you're not going to submit your story to multiple venues, then it's probably not going to get accepted anyway. So you really can't give up too soon. You just have to keep on trying, and then eventually, hopefully, your story does get accepted, and then you have a publication in a literary magazine.